We have Wyatt Claypool with us, and we're going to talk about young people flocking towards Pierre Poilievre's campaign or becoming more conservative. So, while you are young, you're running to become an MP from Calgary. Is there some truth to this statement? You can give me the general idea of what young people are thinking right now.
Yeah, so I'm 24 years old. I've always been kind of a conservative person throughout my life, but so I'm not maybe part of this new wave of people becoming conservative and supporting Pierre Poilievre and the conservatives in this next election, but I can speak to both why I believe Canadian youth are that you actually sent me right before we sat down to talk. Yeah, in Calgary, where I live, housing prices have gone up by 40%, and that's not purely the federal government's fault, but it is the fault of more progressive left-wing politicians, big government individuals. And so I think while many youth are voting conservative more out of reactionary chafing against the failures of the Liberals and the NDP, I think also there is a certain section of the youth who realize that it's actually government that has become the problem, not solution the way that the NDP and the Liberals had spoken about it in the past.
Cost of housing has doubled or has gone up. I gave you the chart of how cost of housing has gone up for single family homes in Canada for the last 10 years. And then you see this low fertility rate as well. And then you see the big government as well. How does a young person process that right now?
Well, I think that this is what you get when the government basically becomes your mom and dad in the eyes of progressives, is that you don't have people actually becoming mothers and fathers themselves because they have this continuing, never-ending dependency kind of relationship with the government and never think about having a dependent themselves or children. It's absolutely true that the West in general is having a fertility crisis. The only two Western countries in the world right now with an above replacement rate, fertility rate, is Israel and it is the Republic of Georgia, which, oddly enough is the where that book comes from behind me is Georgia. And part of the reason also the fertility rate is probably down is because big government policy has made living almost unaffordable. You can't buy a single family detached home that your parents you bought, that you grew up in. People don't want to raise kids in an apartment. And while I think it's good for people to have children, the right now the government's putting up so many barriers in front of you to actually succeeding enough that you feel comfortable doing so, as well as the government has put up a lot of cultural barriers. There is a lot of that propaganda that we see about you can't have kids because you're going to hurt the planet. It's somehow like we've seen these advertisements in Vancouver where they're actually saying that it is an environmental disaster to have children. And I think that that is another thing that youth are chafing against because it's such a defeatist, nihilistic way of living your life that I'm actually going to restrict my standard of living, my enjoyment out of life in order to combat abstract threats that the left is obsessed with.
Do you think a lot of education has got to do with, because I think the public sector education, especially with new immigrants or new Canadians, is that they don't want to send their kids to public school.
Well, I think it's the equity ideology that's hurting schools a lot right now. It's not explicit in the way it's pushed, and I remember some of this stuff coming in when I was in middle school and high school, we had a new pedagogy for teaching math. It was called Discovery Math in Alberta. And the equity aspect of it was trying to make it so that kids who struggled learning math had an easier time. So the entire way we taught math was then geared towards those who were falling behind the most, so that we would break down mathematical problems into 15 separate steps that were each explained by the teacher, in which for someone like myself actually made it harder for me to understand math. I did decently in math. I did 30-1 math in Alberta. We used to have the best education system in the world in Alberta. But now, because we are so equity focused on making sure the bottom is doing better, we're actually sacrificing the gains of those students who were doing well by saying that they have to slow down so that everyone else can sort of catch up. And that's not the way you're supposed to be running an education system. I notice because I help with a robotics nonprofit in the province of Alberta. I just do some like sort of organizing with government for it. But you'll notice that when you go to robotics tournaments, frankly, the main kids who are showing up are kids from minority communities, because the minority communities who value education and who do not trust the public education system to teach their kids are the ones whose kids are getting into very complicated fields like robotics, engineering, medicine, all this stuff. That's why you get a lot of Asian and Indian children getting involved in robotics.
The young people are becoming more conservative. That's what the poll shows, right? And the polling also shows that the Conservative Party is leading in the polls. So there's young people here in Canada and then you see the other conservative movements happening in other countries. So do you think there's a global phenomena to this? Do you think that the young peoples are more aligned to what's happening globally and what's happening in Canada?
I actually think it's a little bit more of a local issue. I think when we take any of these, when we select any of these countries that are having more conservative right-wing governments get elected, Netherlands, Italy, Argentina, like the ones that you gave examples of, I think they are all reacting to local issues. I definitely think it is a youth movement in Canada towards the conservatives, people between, I would say, 18 to 40, a little bit more middle age as well. And I think the reason why the conservatives are appealing so much to the youth is because, in a certain sense, it's actually because the Liberals and the NDP have become very old parties, who are focused on CPP type benefits, sort of old age benefits, different sort of subsidies or sort of social programs for those who are, older Eastern Canadians who they've already worked their jobs. Either they're trying to retire or they have retired, and they just want the government to maintain high amounts of benefits. They want new benefit programs. And I think when young people look at that, in a certain sense, that's kind of depressing. That feels like there's a lack of momentum behind those policies in terms of living life, that I'm basically just going to get a union public sector job, or I'm just going to get some random job, get taxed to death my entire life, but the government has a nice soft bed of benefits for when I retire. That's not something that appeals to young people. Young people want to strive, achieve on their own, not wait for the government to give them all of their money back to them slowly after the age of 55.
Do you think that these are just because of the socioeconomic activity, the lack of that is making people conservative, or it is really the need of the political discourse that's making them conservative?
I think it is a much more of a cultural issue than most people would maybe assume. They look at housing prices, they look at like the economy, it sucks. Maybe that's why young people are voting conservative. To use apolitical young people as an example, because I think it really gets to the heart of why a lot of people are shifting conservative. I know tons of people who do not vote. They are apolitical. They don't care about conservative, liberal, NDP politics. They think it's all a waste of time. They're thinking about going on vacations and, whatever whatever club their friends are going to this weekend. They think woke politics are lame. They think that liberal politics are lame. These people don't actually care about the liberal NDP parties at all. And yes, they never cared about them before, but when you see the apolitical people actually laugh at Trudeau jokes, actually find making fun of woke things funny, that's when the left has lost. Is that when they've become the butt of the joke? Because it was always that the conservatives are the lame ones, we're stodgy, we're old-fashioned, and now conservatives. I don't like this narrative that people put out that conservatives are the new counterculture. We're not. We're just not lame like the liberals are right now. We're not people who are going to police the language that you use. We're not here to tax you to death. We're not here to do all this other stuff. The conservatives feel like the people who are going to leave you alone and be yourself, whereas the liberals are the ones who are looking over your shoulder and seeing what you're saying and doing and then judging you for it.
When you talk to a young voter, how do you approach this?
Well, I just talk about the kind of the feeling of the country right now, that everything does feel super stagnant, that everything does feel like it's managed by a kind of a government nanny state. I've talked to a lot of young people, and they just hate the way that the liberals seem to think that they can't achieve anything. And not like this, even that sounds a little bit like a political way of putting it. It seriously just is that young people think that the Liberal Party is like a parent who won't let you leave the home. And so a lot of people are moving conservative because it feels like the conservatives are the ones who will let you get along with your life and be an adult. It's that the conservatives are actually promising to have less politics in your life and more just, of your own actual, more of your life can actually focus on yourself again.
You're running for the nomination for the Conservative Party. If the party has to do something differently to appeal to young voters, what should they do right now?
I think that as unorthodox as it sounds, because it doesn't sound like a specific youth issue, I would say having a more specific target on cutting immigration would help a lot. When you see the housing prices, I think a lot of youth would actually be appealed to by saying that you will have this many fewer people to compete to in order to buy a new house. And this is the projections we have on how much this will reduce the cost of housing. If you have a really specific housing plan that will actually reduce prices without causing supply to dry up, that's what will get youth to come out. Because I think that if anything, the Conservative Party could even update its slogan, its tagline, because it's the "Bring It Home" is what they've settled on, and that does invoke housing as an issue in and of itself. But I think that you should almost just kind of even simplify it down to housing, family, and and affordability.
How would the young people be inspired or motivated in this country?
As soon as a conservative government hits the ground, what I think they can do to excite young people about the country, about their ability to achieve again, I think it's an income tax cut. An income tax cut just immediately, right off the bat, as soon as you start working from the top marginal rate to the bottom, you actually end up taking more of your own money home. And I think all other things that we need to do in the sort of lane of Javier Milei in Argentina is I think that it needs to be very heavily emphasized all of the wasted spending in government that is going to be cut. That when we find just, departments in the government who do not do anything, it just basically fills a bunch of fake jobs that the government can then secure votes through. When that stuff is cut and people are getting more money put back in their pockets, I think that's what makes people feel more optimistic and excited about the future, is when they can actually see real results in their wallets. I don't like the idea that let's get the budget balance first, then we'll cut taxes. You do the tax cut first and let people benefit right away, rather than the benefits always being promised in the future.
Do you think it is to the benefit of the party, especially the Conservative Party who's leading in the polls, or any politician to talk about lowering the housing prices or making it affordable?
Well, and here's a specific plan I had for my own campaign. And the specific riding I'm running is Calgary Signal Hill, and it's a riding probably where the housing prices are the highest in Calgary. It does have a lot more upper middle class type families living in it. But one of the things that we can do, which is not only something that appeals to younger people, but also older people, is having the federal government, because we all acknowledge that housing prices are not the responsibility of the federal government inherently. Immigration rates can affect it. A lot of other taxes can affect housing prices. But one thing the federal government needs to do is it needs to synchronize the housing policy across the country, not just hope that all the rest of the country is going to get on board. And I think one thing that needs to be done is that the government under the Conservatives needs to put pressure on municipalities in order to make it easier to build houses as well as to lower property taxes. Because that's also what makes property so expensive, is that whoever's selling their home is trying to get back a bunch of the money that they lost on property taxes. And so that's shooting up prices, as well as the inherent difficulty it is to buy, like in order to build in these different cities. So in Calgary, especially when we just experienced a 7.8% property tax increase, and that's on top of all the other increases we've seen over the past decade, is what we need the federal government to maybe do is step in and threaten to like claw back infrastructure grants if the city does not lower property taxes and make it easier to build. Because for one thing, the city's trying to have its cake and eat it too, raises property taxes and then spends none of the increased revenues on actual infrastructure. They just beg the federal government for more money. And at the same time, with all the restrictive housing policies, whenever the federal government does give a city like Calgary money, that money gets destroyed and chewed up by all the local regulations and zoning laws that they have to follow. So if the city of Calgary still wants, and other cities want that federal assistance, they have to help the federal government help them better by actually making it an affordable place to invest.
Do you think it has a lot to do with Canada has to go through a lot of deregulation? Do you think in order to succeed, we need to loosen up this environment of, doing business, getting it I would say, off the government's, shelves? Do you think that's needed?
That's actually one of my main pitches as a candidate for the Calgary Signal Hill nomination, is that even if in a conservative government, if I'm the MP, even if I'm a backbencher and I'm not a cabinet minister, what we need is for MPs to be going through our regulatory books with a highlighter and just getting rid of stuff, just highlighting stuff that can be slashed. Because it's the absurdity, and I think the best way of putting it, or the best example, is if you want to transport different types of vegetables, there are entire regulatory books of the exact temperature that you need different types of beans to be chilled at in order to drive them from one place to another. And it is literally like microscopic, the differences between different products that you're shipping. And that basically, like, doesn't make for like a pun intended, there's no, like, it doesn't make a hill of beans of a difference of what you actually transport them at. There's like a range of what you could do, but the government is so oddly specific on this is what green beans need to be shipped at, this is what these need to be shipped at. And the funny thing is that right now the Liberals and the NDP are trying to go after the large grocery store chains as if they're price gouging consumers, trying to blame the grocery store chains for the inflation, when the biggest allies over time of large corporations and grocery store chains have been the Liberals and the NDP, who their biggest subsidies to them have been the massive amounts of regulations and laws that the grocery store chains have to follow. It has wiped out the ability for smaller competitors to organically rise the market because of all the different regulations, all the different piece of legislation that you have to navigate to operate without getting sued by the government. It makes it so that there's only one way to succeed in the grocery market, just to only talk with the grocery industry for now, is that with all of the different things that you have, all the different regulations you have to follow, all the high taxes that you have to pay, it means that the only way of being profitable in the grocery industry pretty much is being a massive big box store, because smaller grocers cannot survive with all the regulations. So you can't get into the market and try and hyper kind of concentrate your appeal in one area, or I'm going to make sure I do one thing really well. That's just not how it works because of all of the regulations and restrictions that you have to follow. You can't really do that. So it makes it so that everything becomes more and more alike over time in order to not only follow the regulations from government, but also maybe even qualify for certain subsidies. This is where the mainstream media in Canada keeps looking more and more the same, and all their coverage becomes more and more like conglomerated, because when all the media relies on government subsidies, they're all effectively incentivized to report the stories the same way.
What do you think will happen if the way the Liberal and NDP are approaching this issue? What do you think will end up happening?
Well, this has been one of the most kind of underreported scandals of the Liberal Party. It's a little bit new, but a massive scandal from the Liberals is that they're trying to get all the grocery store chains to sign on to this grocery code of conduct or whatever. And really what it is that they're trying to force the grocery stores to take the blame for inflation, as well at the same time effectively allow liberal government commissars to sit over them and dictate what prices can be, how much you're allowed to raise prices on different products month to month, where it's based a massive big government takeover of the grocery industry. And this is what the government's been trying to do in many, many different sectors under the excuse that they have to fight inflation, the inflation they caused because they act like it's price gouging. The government is putting more regulatory infrastructure over the different industries in Canada, like groceries, farmers, oil and gas, housing, all this stuff. They're putting more regulatory burden on them. And then when that ends up hurting the industry even more and they have to raise prices further, then the government takes basically economic managers and places them in charge of being able to set prices for the entire economy. It's legitimately a socialist takeover of many of these industries.
So, like, what does it really mean for the people? Like, do you think they're going to be moving away from the structure of having, private players and, competing markets and things like that to this part where they don't even have basic food supplies?
To be clear, socialism doesn't just mean that when you walk into a store, there's government branding on the outside. It just means that the government runs the economy. And that's what the liberals and the NDP are trying to do, is they want more and more control through private businesses on the economy. They want more controls on the economy, despite the fact that they are, in essence, kind of letting private business still operate. But if the private business does not operate in the way that they like, then the government will pass more regulations, taxes, and penalties in order to kind of club them back into line. This is effectively how the fascist Italian government worked, was that government and trade unions, stakeholders, this is what the whole WF stakeholder capitalism thing is all based on, is that government and trade unions basically bullied private business into like meeting their quotas. Whatever they came to an agreement with, the trade unions and the government would just cram that down on private businesses. So on the surface, it looked like fascist Italy had all these private businesses, small, medium, and large businesses that were freely operating the economy, when really they were just acting like government employees, whether they were the CEO or they weren't.
Anything last you want to add up before we end this chat?
Well, yeah, I think that really what a lot of the failures of the liberals and the NDP come down to is the idea that somehow government managers and bureaucrats are going to be able to manage an industry or an individual thing better than those who are actually involved in that industry or who do that thing. That's why the conservatives are popular right now. It's not just because of the general idea of freedom. It's because people just like the idea of being able to succeed on their own, even outside of just the ability to, speak freely and to be able to choose what you buy, what job you take, and whatnot. I think people also more so focus on the idea of being able to succeed on your own merits and know that everything that you have is actually yours. In Canada right now, so little of what you have is yours, whether it's because government regulates it on the time, place, and manner that you can do, use, or say things. And also, at the same time, it means that whenever you do succeed, so often in Canada, it's because you've taken advantages of the subsidies or you've gotten regulatory waivers. We're in an economy right now where it is so government managed, so government determined whether you succeed or fail. Nobody is really their own person anymore.
Maybe spend a couple of more minutes and talk about Pierre's campaign and the approach that the Conservative Party or Pierre's office has so far.
Yeah, and I'll talk about it more so by contrasting Mr. Aaron O'Toole, the previous Conservative leader, with Pierre Poilievre. Pierre Poilievre, not as many people know this, during the leadership campaign in 2022, basically all of his videos that went viral were pretty much shot by him, a camera guy, and a friendly advisor, like an advisor who's a friend of his. They did not go through the Conservative Party's, general checklist of making sure that something is on brand enough to be able to post. Pierre Poilievre just did stuff that sounded right. He did things that seemed right. He actually listened to his gut, and it paid off. With Aaron O'Toole as the leader of the Conservative Party and throughout his leadership campaign, it was stodgy. It was very much focus groups to death. He was doing things that seemed like it was uncontroversial and everyone can agree on it. Well, just saying things that nobody can disagree with doesn't mean exactly people will show up and vote for you. Pierre Poilievre is actually picking fights that he can win because it's not only the right thing to do, but people actually want a politician who's willing to step up and speak about that. That's why Poilievre is gaining so much, and especially other conservative leaders like Premier Danielle Smith in Alberta and Blaine Higgs in New Brunswick, they're benefiting by the fact that they're taking hard stances and they're fighting for the right positions. Conservatives in the past, the Andrew Scheer's, Aaron O'Toole's, Brian Mulrooney set, they only picked fights that they were basically assured by advisors that they could win, and everyone could kind of see through what they were doing. It felt mechanical. It felt like it was just whenever they said something that you liked, it was purely pandering, and that this person would never actually fight for you if you were attacked by the left-wing mob. Pierre Poilievre, everyone will kind of go after him once in a while and say, well, he's being too critical these days. He should ask more prime ministerial. Pierre Poilievre has to fight back and prove that he's not an Aaron O'Toole who won't fight for you, and that's why he's fighting every single day in order to prove that he will stand up to mainstream media bullies, liberal government bullies, and he'll actually be able to take hard stances that previous conservative leaders would say, too controversial, don't want to do it, maybe that alienates X, Y, and Z base. It's like, well, is it the right thing to do or not? And I think that's what he's more so basing decisions on these days. Is it the right thing to do, or is it, the corporate decision?
Thank you so much